Hello everybody, this is Bird Brain. We're here, we are nerdy for the birdies. So, this is the first time I've done one of these, but we're actually going to do a game preview for the Eagles-Packers playoff game at the Link on Sunday. Going to be doing a breakdown. It's not going to be anything too crazy, but we'll kind of be looking at the matchups of this game, X factors in this game to kind of look out for, and really how this game could go. So we're going to break it down to the three categories, and the first category is the Eagles offense versus the Packers defense. The first thing to look at is the trenches, and that's the Packers defensive line and the Eagles offensive line. And with that, you got to look at the idea that the Packers, they're a good unit when it comes to pressuring the quarterback. They're not a great unit in terms of finishing and getting sacks, and we saw that week one. They had 2 sacks against the Eagles, one of them being a play where the Eagles thought the Packers were offsides, and half the offensive line didn't move, thinking they were going to get the call. You know, it wasn't exactly a well set up thing, and then Rashawn Gary just kind of comes around the corner unblocked and gets sacked, or sacks Jalen. So that, that wasn't charged as a sack to any offensive lineman. And then you had the play later on in the game. I think Jalen gets sacked by Keyshawn Nixon after he escaped the pocket, so that's not really the defensive line. Pressure might be a problem, but in terms of pure sacking, the Packers are not the best at it. The Eagles have a pretty good pass blocking line. Jalen invites a lot of pressure as a quarterback because of his scrambling ability. So that's just something to think about. Another thing is the run game. The Packers have one of the better run defenses in the league. Since their week 1 matchup, I believe they've only given up 100 yards to one other running back, and that was Jonathan Taylor the very next week. So they really haven't been gashed that badly, but the Eagles did get them. Saquon had 2 rushing touchdowns, had over 100 yards. Jalen had some runs against them as well. The Eagles have been generally very good against good run defenses. It's never perfect. Like, they've had games, like, for example, against Cleveland, where they very much loaded the box and Saquon didn't really get much of anything. And then Jalen has a really good day throwing it through the air. You played the Ravens. It wasn't like their biggest rushing day, but they still kind of beat the Ravens in the trenches there with the run game, especially late with Saquon. So that is something else to think about. So it's not going to be a day where it's like Saquon's going to get 30 carries and get like 200 yards. It's probably going to be around like a 20 carry, maybe like a 110 yard day for Saquon. And then, of course, our X factor in this matchup is Xavier McKinney, for this portion at least, because there's no Jair Alexander, so the Packers secondary is going to be interesting. And I think there's going to be some matchups to be had there for the Eagles. But if you remember, Xavier McKinney picked off Jalen Hurts. It was the first third down of the season. Xavier McKinney is a really good safety. He has 8 interceptions this offseason. I know everyone's talking about the Giants letting go of Saquon. They let go of a really good safety too. McKinney's, the last couple of times he's played Jalen, he's gotten picks off of him, so you got to be really careful of him. You also got to be very careful, just in general, not to force it too much. But again, I think these corners are a bit more beatable. The defense hasn't changed too much without Jair Alexander, as he has missed a majority of the season. But obviously they are better with him than without. So the reality of the situation is that I do think you're going to get matchups for AJ and Devontae, depending on how they decide to play them. My guess is probably just throw to the opposite side McKinney is, and you'll probably get a favorable matchup. That's enough of the Eagles offense versus the Packers defense. We'll move to the Packers offense versus the Eagles defense. And the first thing is the Packers passing game. And there's some concerns because in the last game, Christian Watson, Packers wide receiver, tore his ACL. And that's a huge loss for them. He's their field stretcher. The Packers are kind of an interesting team because they don't really have a wide receiver 1. They kind of just have guys that have very specific roles. And depending on how the game goes, they'll get featured in different ways. Christian Watson wasn't necessarily a huge part of the first matchup. They targeted him early. He had the deep ball against Quinyon. Quinyon beat him there and knocked it down. Could have been a touchdown, but it was incomplete. He did beat Devontae for a touchdown, but that was a very short play. With no Christian Watson, who's your field stretcher? And in that first game, you had Jaden Reed. Jaden Reed really did a number on this defense. He had over 150 yards from scrimmage and 2 touchdowns. Could have even had a third, which if that were to count, he would have had damn near 200 yards from scrimmage against this defense. So, Jaden Reed, probably the most successful receiver to go up against us this year, relatively speaking, but we haven't really faced many guys that have had that degree of success. Maybe you could say, like, Puka when we played the Rams a little bit, but not really many guys have had that degree of success against us. So, just got to make sure we take care of him. That's probably going to be a responsibility more on Cooper DeJean if he's going to line inside more. Who's going to be their big play threat? Another potential player for that big play threat for the Packers could be Tucker Kraft. He's actually a really sneaky kind of weapon for them. You know, everyone focuses on the wide receivers, and Tucker Kraft just keeps making big plays in games for the Packers. He'll have like a random 20-something yard catch or a couple of them in a game, and you know he'll get some big chunk yards for the Packers. So that's the first point. Second point, trying to pressure Love. Jordan Love is a quarterback that does not get sacked very often. He has taken 14 sacks this season in totality. Now, he's missed a little bit of time, but even so, 14 is absolutely insane for a 17-game season. So you're probably not going to get a lot of sacks, and this is not the best defensive line in terms of sack production, but this defensive line gets a lot of pressure. And I think that you are playing against the Packers O-line that is also very good. So really, in this game, the trenches are kind of even. You kind of have, on both sides, pass rushes that are good at getting pressures, not a ton of sacks, and you have offensive lines that are pretty good at, handling pressures. Jalen just tends to take more sacks because he tends to scramble around the pocket and buy time. But you can pressure Love. And when you pressure Love, that's when those turnovers would come up. The Eagles got him on a big pressure towards the middle of the game where he threw one up off his back foot to Reed. He has a real tendency to throw off his back foot. So he'll drift kind of backwards and then throw off his back foot, and it generally works, but sometimes it leads to bad turnovers. He's been really good as of late, though, when it comes to turnovers, and a lot of that goes to our X factor, Josh Jacobs. The Packers, at some point in the middle of the season, really just transformed into being a running team, and they're a run-heavy offense, and we've seen that really down the stretch. That's what their bread and butter has been. Not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not a mark on Jordan Love in any way, but they're not as reliant on him as a thrower, so a lot easier to handle in that category. So then we got to talk about special teams, and this will be the final part. And for special teams, I'm just going to talk about both in one. First thing, is Jake Elliott a concern for this matchup? You know, Jake Elliott has missed kicks a lot this season. Almost every game he's missed some kick at some point, it feels like. Especially from 50 plus. He's only made one all season. He missed a 39-yarder just last week. And that's a concern, because when you're calling plays as an offense and you get to certain situations and downs and distances, you know, you have to wonder, do I trust the offense more or the kicker? And in playoff games, you know, there's no mulligan, there's no nothing. You know, there's no, all right, if we lose this game, whatever, we have a game next week, we keep going. No, there is no next week. So every decision is going to be magnified, and Jake Elliott has to play better, and when he's called upon, he's got to make the kicks. So he's been really good in the postseason in his career. I don't believe he's missed a postseason kick. I think that's still a stat, so we'll see if that holds up. The next thing is special teams penalties. I feel like we have a lot of them on kickoff units, especially, or on punt coverage units, especially with terms of like starting too early, getting an extra 5 yards. You're playing a really good Packers special teams unit, and I'll get to why with the X factor in a sec, but these extra yards are just opportunities to give Packers shorter fields and, you know, quicker first downs, better opportunities. If you guys remember the Commanders game a couple weeks back, that was a huge problem. And that's why the X factor to really look out for is Keyshawn Nixon. He's a really good kick returner. He didn't necessarily burn us in week 1, but if you remember back to the 2022 matchup, he had a couple of big returns in that game that really helped the Packers out with their offense. So you got to be very careful balancing out the two. You got to be careful with penalties. You got to make sure you corral him, probably kicking a lot of touchbacks. So really, the Eagles, I do feel very comfortable with this game. I feel like they have a lot of advantages. They're healthy, for one thing. They're not missing any starters. Obviously, they're coming in with rest. They're the home team, all these things. And I think they are the better team compared to them in Green Bay. But the Packers are still a very good team. They're probably I know they're the 7th seed in the NFC, but in my honest opinion, they're probably the 4th or 5th best team in a conference where everyone is so close to each other in record. This game's going to be a little bit closer than I think people realize. I've seen some people think it's going to be a blowout, which I don't agree with, but we'll see what happens. If it is a blowout, I'm not going to complain as long as the Eagles are the ones doing the ones that are leading it, obviously. So, so if you guys like this, I'll do another one if the Eagles beat the Packers this week. Anyways, this is Bird Brain. Hope you guys enjoyed being nerdy for the birdies. Fly, Eagles, fly. See you around.